the day the empire hit a wall in Caracas. Let me take you back to March 18, 2024, not a date that made many headlines, but one that should have. That was the day the U.S. Southern Command quietly shelved its most ambitious contingency plans for Venezuela, not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic whimper. No press conference, no dramatic announcement, just a few leaked memos and a sudden shift in Pentagon budget allocations. On the surface, it looked like just another routine adjustment in military planning. But if you've been watching this region as long as I have, decades of tracking how Washington's ambitions collide with reality, you know this wasn't routine at all. This was the sound of American power hitting a wall, not just in Venezuela, but in the broader contest for the future of Latin America. And what makes it truly significant is that almost no one in the mainstream is talking about why it happened or what it means for the rest of us. I've spent my career studying how great powers overreach, how their strategies unravel, and how the gap between their ambitions and their capabilities grows wider with each miscalculation. Venezuela is the latest case study in that pattern, but it's also a microcosm of America's fading ability to impose its will on a world that no longer bends to it. The official story is simple, almost reassuring. The reality? Far more complicated, far more dangerous, and far more revealing about where U.S. foreign policy is headed. So let's start with what they want you to believe. The official controlled, limited, and justified response. If you've been following the news, you've heard some version of Venezuela under Nicolas Maduro is a failed state, a narco-dictatorship propped up by Russian mercenaries and Chinese loans, a threat to regional stability and U.S. security. The Biden administration, we're told, has been pursuing a dual-track approach, tough sanctions to squeeze the regime economically, while keeping military options on the table as a last resort. The goal? To force Maduro to the negotiating table, restore democracy, and prevent Venezuela from becoming a Russian or Chinese beachhead in America's backyard. The evidence seems compelling. The U.S. has imposed crippling sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, frozen billions in state assets, and indicted Maduro himself on drug trafficking charges. The Treasury Department has gone after the regime's inner circle, while the State Department has dangled the possibility of sanctions relief in exchange for free and fair elections. Meanwhile, the Pentagon has quietly exited its presence in the region, conducting joint exercises with Colombia and Guyana, deploying naval assets to the Caribbean, and even dusting off old Cold War-era contingency plans for a potential intervention. The media has played its part, too. Outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post have run stories about Venezuela's descent into chaos, its role as a transit hub for cocaine bound for the U.S., and the growing influence of Russian Wagner Group mercenaries and Iranian-backed militias. The message is Venezuela is a problem, and the U.S. is taking measured, responsible steps to address it. But here's the problem with this: it's not the whole story. In fact, it's not even the most important part of the story. Deconstructing the what's really happening in Venezuela. Let me tell you what the official narrative leaves out. First, the idea that U.S. sanctions are a precision tool designed to target the regime while sparing the Venezuelan people is a fiction. The data doesn't support it. A 2022 study by the Center for Economic and Policy Research found that U.S. sanctions on Venezuela were responsible for the deaths of at least 40,000 people between 2017 and 2019 alone, due to shortages of food, medicine, and basic supplies. That's not collateral damage, that's a humanitarian catastrophe by design. And yet, the sanctions remain in place, not because they're working, but because they're politically convenient. Second, the claim that Maduro is entirely dependent on Russian and Chinese support is overstated. Yes, Moscow and Beijing have provided loans, military advisors, and diplomatic cover, but Venezuela's survival has far more to do with its own resilience and Washington's miscalculations than with foreign patrons. The regime has adapted to sanctions by deepening ties with Iran, Turkey, and even some European firms willing to flout U.S. restrictions. It has also exploited divisions within the opposition, co-opting some factions while crushing others. Most importantly, it has maintained control over the military, which remains the ultimate arbiter of power in Venezuela. And here's the longer the U.S. squeezes Venezuela, the more the military digs in, seeing itself as the last line of defense against foreign intervention. Third, the idea that the U.S. has a viable military option in Venezuela is a dangerous fantasy. The Pentagon's own wargames have repeatedly shown that any intervention would be a logistical nightmare, requiring tens of thousands of troops, a prolonged occupation, and a level of political will that simply doesn't exist in Washington. The last time the US tried something like this in AMA in 1989, it worked because Manuel Noriega was isolated, the Omanian military was weak, and the operation was over in a matter of days. Venezuela is not AMA. It's a country of 28 million people with a battle-hardened military, a population that remembers the US-backed coup against Hugo Chavez in 2002, and a government that has spent years preparing for asymmetric warfare. But here's where it gets really interesting. The real reason the US military plans hit a wall in Venezuela has less to do with Venezuela itself and more to do with the broader geopolitical landscape. And that's where we need to out. The big Venezuela as a proxy in the new Cold War. If you want to understand why the US is struggling in Venezuela, you have to see it as part of a much larger contest, not just over a single country, but over the future of global order. We are living through the death throes of the unipolar moment, the period after the Cold War when the US stood as the world's sole superpower. That era is over. What we're seeing now is the rise of a multipolar world, where power is diffused among multiple centers: Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and increasingly, regional players like India, Turkey, and Iran. Venezuela is a perfect example of how this new reality is playing out. For the US, it's not just about Maduro or even about oil. It's about preventing Latin America from slipping into the orbit of America's rivals. For Russia, Venezuela is a way to bleed the US in its own backyard, forcing Washington to divert resources and attention away from more critical theaters like Eastern Europe and the Indo-Pacific. For China, it's about securing access to resources and markets while avoiding direct confrontation with the US. And for the Venezuelan regime, it's about playing these powers off each other to survive. This is classic great power competition, but with a twist. Unlike the Cold War, where the US and USSR divided the world into clear spheres of influence, today's contest is messier, more fluid, and far more dangerous. The US still operates under the assumption that it can dictate outcomes in its near abroad, but the reality is that its leverage is diminishing. Every time Washington imposes sanctions, its adversaries find ways to circumvent them. Every time it threatens military action, its allies grow more reluctant to follow. And every time it tries to isolate a regime like Venezuela's, that regime finds new patrons willing to prop it up. Let me give you an example. In 2019, the US recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president and rallied dozens of countries to do the same. It seemed like a masterstroke until it wasn't. Guaidó's support collapsed, the military remained loyal to Maduro, and countries like Mexico, Argentina, and even some in Europe began to distance themselves from the US position. Why? Because they saw the writing on the US couldn't deliver on its promises, and they didn't want to be on the wrong side of history. This is the pattern we're seeing across the global south. Countries are hedging their bets, refusing to choose sides, and asserting their own agency. And the US? It's still acting like it's 1999, when it could topple regimes in Serbia or Iraq with minimal pushback. But the world has changed, and Washington hasn't caught up. The military intervention was never an option. Now, let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where the rubber meets the road. The US has a long history of intervention in Latin America: Guatemala in 1954, Cuba in 1961, Chile in 1973, Grenada in 1983, MA in 1989, but those were different times. The world was simpler, the stakes were lower, and the US faced no serious rivals in its own hemisphere. Today, the calculus is entirely different. First, the military balance. Venezuela's armed forces may not be a match for the US in a conventional war, but they don't need to be. They're designed for asymmetric warfare, guerrilla tactics, sabotage, urban resistance. The regime has spent years preparing for this, stockpiling weapons, training militias, and even setting up people's defense units modeled on Iran's Basij. Any US intervention would quickly turn into a quagmire, with American troops bogged down in a protracted counterinsurgency campaign. And let's not Venezuela shares a border with Colombia, a country with its own history of guerrilla warfare and a population deeply divided over US intervention. Second, the regional response. In the past, the US could count on the support of its Latin American allies. Today, that's no longer the case. Mexico has refused to recognize Guaidó, Brazil under Lula has pursued a policy of non-intervention, and even Colombia, Washington's closest partner in the region, has been reluctant to get dragged into a conflict. The Organization of American States, once a tool of U.S. influence, is now deeply divided, with many members opposing Washington's hardline stance. And let's not forget the elephant in the China and Russia. Both have warned the U.S. against military action, and both have the means to make an intervention far costlier than Washington anticipates. Third, the domestic political constraints. The American public has no appetite for another war, especially not in a country that poses no direct threat to the U.S. homeland. The failures in Iraq and Afghanistan are still fresh in the public's mind, and the idea of sending troops to Venezuela would be a non-starter for most voters. Even the hawks in Congress know this, which is why they've focused on sanctions and covert operations rather than overt military action. But here's the most important: the U.S. military knows all of this. The Pentagon's war games have consistently shown that an intervention in Venezuela would be a disaster. The costs would far outweigh the benefits, the risks of escalation would be unacceptably high, and the likelihood of success would be low. That's why, when the Biden administration quietly shelved its contingency plans in March, it wasn't because of a sudden change of heart. It was because the military brass made it clear that this was a fight they couldn't win. The domestic why Venezuela became a political football. Of course, none of this happens in a vacuum. U.S. policy toward Venezuela isn't just about geopolitics or military strategy, it's also about domestic politics. And that's where things get really messy. Let's start with Florida. No state has more influence over U.S. policy toward Venezuela than Florida, home to a large and politically active Venezuelan exile community. For years, politicians from both parties have dared to this constituency, promising to take a hard line against Maduro in the hopes of winning their votes. This is why you saw Donald Trump impose some of the harshest sanctions on Venezuela during his presidency, and why Joe Biden has been reluctant to ease them, despite the humanitarian cost. But here's the: Florida is a swing state, and its politics are shifting. The Venezuelan exile community is not monolithic. Some favor a hardline approach, but others, especially younger Venezuelans, are more open to dialogue and negotiation. Meanwhile, the broader Latino electorate in Florida is becoming more diverse, with growing numbers of Puerto Ricans, Colombians, and Nicaraguans who don't share the same priorities as the Venezuelan exiles. This creates a dilemma for how do you appeal to the hardliners without alienating everyone else. Then there's the role of key administration figures. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been the public face of the Biden administration's Venezuela policy, but behind the... And let's not forget the role of Congress. The Venezuela issue has become a partisan football, with Republicans accusing Biden of being soft on Maduro and Democrats countering that Trump's policies failed. This has led to a situation where neither side has an incentive to pursue a realistic policy. Instead, they're locked in a cycle of performative toughness, where the goal isn't to solve the problem but to score political points. The result? A policy that satisfies no one. The hardliners think Biden isn't doing enough, the pragmatists think he's doing too much, and the Venezuelan people are left to suffer the consequences. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this leave us? Let's game out the most likely scenarios, because none of them are particularly encouraging. Scenario 1, the frozen conflict. In this scenario, the status quo persists. The U.S. maintains sanctions, Maduro remains in power, and Venezuela continues its slow-motion collapse. The regime survives by playing Russia and China off each other, while the opposition remains divided and ineffective. The U.S. occasionally rattles its sabers, but never follows through on military threats. This is the most likely outcome, but it's also the most unstable. A frozen conflict can last for years, but it's always one crisis away from boiling over. Scenario 2, the negotiated transition. Here, the U.S. and Venezuela reach a sanctions relief in exchange for free and fair elections. Maduro steps down, and a transitional government takes over. This is the outcome the Biden administration claims to want, but it's far from guaranteed. For one thing, Maduro has no incentive to negotiate unless he's convinced that the alternative is worse. For another, any deal would require concessions from both sides, and neither is in a mood to compromise. Still, this is the best-case scenario, and it's not impossible, especially if the US is willing to offer real incentives, like lifting sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector. Scenario 3, the escalation spiral. This is the nightmare scenario. A miscalculation, a US drone strike, a Venezuelan attack on a US asset, a Russian or Chinese provocation leads to a rapid escalation. The US imposes a naval blockade, Venezuela responds with cyber attacks or asymmetric strikes, and before you know it, you've got a full-blown crisis on your hands. This is the least likely scenario, but it's also the most dangerous. And given the current tensions, it's not something we can rule out entirely. Now, let me be none of these scenarios are good. Even the best-case outcome, a negotiated transition, would be messy, uncertain, and fraught with risks. But the alternative, continuing down the current path, is even worse. Because the longer this goes on, the more entrenched Maduro becomes, the more Venezuela's institutions decay, and the harder it becomes to find a way out. The grand strategy why America keeps getting this wrong. This brings me to the bigger why does the US keep making the same mistakes? Why, after decades of failed interventions and misguided policies, does Washington still think it can impose its will on the world? The answer lies in America's grand strategy, or lack thereof. For the past 3 decades, the US has operated under the assumption that it can and should maintain global hegemony. This is what scholars call liberal hegemony, the idea that the US has both the right and the responsibility to shape the world in its own image, using a combination of military power, economic coercion, and ideological persuasion. The problem? It doesn't work. Not anymore. The US has spent trillions of dollars and thousands of lives trying to remake the world in its image, and the results speak for themselves. Iraq is a failed state. Afghanistan is back in the hands of the Taliban. Libya is a haven for terrorists. Syria is a shattered country. And now, Venezuela is on the brink of becoming another cautionary tale. The pattern is the US overestimates its ability to control events, underestimates the resilience of its adversaries, and ignores the unintended consequences of its actions. It assumes that other countries will bend to its will, that sanctions will work, that military force is a viable option. But the world has changed, and America's playbook hasn't. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about a broader crisis of American statecraft. The US is still trying to act like the world's policeman, but it no longer has the resources, the legitimacy, or the domestic support to do so. And yet, the foreign policy establishment keeps doubling down on the same failed strategies, because that's what it knows, that's what it's comfortable with. Let me give you a historical parallel. In the late 19th century, the British Empire was the world's dominant power. It had the largest navy, the most advanced economy, and a global network of colonies and bases. But by the early 20th century, it was clear that Britain could no longer sustain its empire. The costs were too high, the challenges too great, and the rise of new powers like Germany and the US made it impossible to maintain its dominance. The result? A slow, painful decline, marked by overstretch, miscalculation, and ultimately, retreat. Sound familiar? The US is not Britain, and the 21. And the 21st century is not the 19th, but the parallels are too striking to ignore. The uncomfortable truth is that empires don't collapse overnight, they erode at the edges, one overreach at a time, until the center can no longer hold. Venezuela is just the latest crack in the foundation. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about ideology or even oil, though both play a role. It's about the fundamental mismatch between America's strategic ambitions and its actual capacity to enforce them. The US military is the most powerful fighting force in history, but power isn't the same as control. You can bomb a country into rubble, but you can't bomb it into democracy. You can impose sanctions that strangle an economy, but you can't sanction a population into submission without creating blowback. And in Venezuela, as in so many other places, the blowback is coming. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. The Pentagon's 2018 National Defense Strategy, written under then-Secretary James Mattis, identified great power competition with China and Russia as the primary challenge to U.S. dominance. The logic was if America didn't push back now, it would lose its edge later. But here's the while Washington was busy pivoting to Asia and preparing for a potential war over Taiwan or the South China Sea, it assumed that its backyard would remain stable. It didn't account for the fact that adversaries like Russia and China would exploit those very assumptions, turning America's own neighborhood into a battleground of influence. Take Russia's involvement in Venezuela. In March 2019, 2 Russian military planes landed in Caracas carrying nearly 100 troops and cybersecurity experts, a move that sent shockwaves through Washington. The official line from Moscow was that they were there to service Russian-made military equipment, Venezuela's aging Su-30 fighters and S-300 air defense systems. But the timing was no coincidence. This was a direct response to the U.S. recognition of Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president just months earlier. Russia wasn't just propping up Maduro, it was sending a "you wanna play regime change in our sphere? Fine. We'll do the same in yours." And China? Beijing has poured over $60 billion into Venezuela since 2007, most of it in loans secured by oil. When the U.S. imposed sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector in 2019, China didn't flinch. It simply rerouted Venezuelan crude through Malaysia and India, using a web of shell commies to evade U.S. restrictions. By 2023, China was importing more Venezuelan oil than ever before, not out of altruism, but because it saw an opportunity to weaken U.S. leverage while securing a steady energy supply. The result? America's sanctions, meant to cripple Maduro, ended up strengthening China's hand instead. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. is still thinking in terms of unipolar dominance, but the world has moved on. Russia and China don't need to match America's military might to undermine it. They just need to make U.S. interventions too costly, too messy, too unpredictable. And in Venezuela, they've done exactly that. Every time the U.S. ramps up pressure, Russia sends in advisors. Every time the U.S. tightens sanctions, China finds a workaround. Every time the U.S. threatens military action, Iran steps in with drones and intelligence support. It's death by 1,000 cuts, not a direct confrontation, but a slow, grinding erosion of American influence. Now, let's talk about the military implications. The U.S. has spent the last 2 decades preparing for high-end conflicts, carrier strike groups, fifth-generation fighters, hypersonic missiles. But the wars it actually fights are messy, asymmetric, and politically toxic. Venezuela is a perfect example. The U.S. could, in theory, launch a limited strike on Venezuelan military targets. But what then? Maduro's regime is deeply entrenched, with a loyal security apparatus and a population that, while suffering, has been radicalized by years of U.S. pressure. A bombing campaign wouldn't topple the government, it would create a power vacuum, and in a country with one of the highest homicide rates in the world, that vacuum would be filled by armed gangs, Colombian guerrillas, and transnational criminal networks. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same dynamic that turned Libya into a failed state after NATO's 2011 intervention. And that's before we even get to the regional fallout. Brazil, under Lula, has already made it clear it won't support U.S. military action. Colombia, America's closest ally in the region, is dealing with its own internal crises and can't afford to be seen as Washington's proxy. Mexico, under AMLO, has taken a neutral stance, refusing to recognize Guaidó and deepening ties with Maduro. Even the OAS, once a reliable tool of U.S. influence, is divided. The U.S. would be going it alone, and in Latin America, that's a recipe for disaster. Let me give you another historical parallel. In 1983, the U.S. invaded Grenada, a tiny Caribbean island, to oust a Marxist government. The operation was a military success, but it was also a political disaster. The UN General Assembly condemned the invasion as a violation of international law. Even America's closest allies, like Britain, were furious. Margaret Thatcher, who had been kept in the dark about the operation, called Reagan to demand an explanation. The message was even in its own backyard, the U.S. couldn't act with impunity. Fast forward to today. The world is far more interconnected, far more skeptical of U.S. power, and far more capable of pushing back. If the U.S. were to launch a military strike on Venezuela, the backlash would be immediate and global. Russia would escalate in Ukraine. China would accelerate its military buildup in the South China Sea. Iran would step up attacks on U.S. forces in the Middle East. And Latin American nations, already wary of U.S. interventionism, would rally around Maduro not out of love for his regime, but out of principle. The U.S. would find itself isolated, its credibility in tatters, its alliances strained. So where does that leave us? The foreign policy establishment will tell you that the answer is more pressure, more sanctions, more covert action. But that's the same playbook that got us here. The real question is whether America can adapt or whether it will keep doubling down on a strategy that no longer works. The British Empire didn't fall because it lacked power, it fell because it refused to accept that the world had changed. The US is at a similar crossroads. The choice isn't between dominance and decline. It's between adaptation and irrelevance. And right now, Venezuela is showing us which path America is on. Now, what most people don't realize is that this foreign policy paralysis isn't just happening in the halls of the State Department or the Pentagon, it's playing out in real time in the domestic political arena, and that's where the real danger lies. The US isn't just failing to adapt to a changing world, it's failing to adapt to its own political realities. And in Washington, when foreign policy hits a wall, the default response isn't introspection, it's escalation. That's the cycle we're trapped in, and Venezuela is the perfect case study. Let me explain why this matters. The Biden administration inherited a Venezuela policy that was already a mess, but instead of recalibrating, it doubled down. Why? Because in Washington, admitting failure is political suicide. The Trump administration had bet everything on Juan Guaidó, recognizing him as interim president in January 2019, imposing crippling sanctions, and even attempting a coup in April of that year with the botched Operation Gideon. When that failed, Trump's team did what all administrations they kicked the can down the road. They left Biden with a policy that was all sticks and no carrots, a strategy that had already alienated allies and hardened Maduro's position. Here's the uncomfortable: Biden didn't have the political space to change course. The moment he signaled any softening on Venezuela, he would have faced a firestorm from Republicans and even some Democrats. Senator Marco Rubio, who has made Venezuela a personal crusade, would have accused him of appeasing dictators. The Miami lobby, which wields outsized influence in Florida politics, would have pounced. And let's not forget the human rights groups and the Venezuelan exile community, who have spent years demanding regime change and would see any negotiation as betrayal. So Biden did what all politicians do when they're boxed: he split the difference. He kept the sanctions in place but allowed Chevron to resume limited oil operations in Venezuela in late 2022, a move that was framed as a humanitarian gesture but was really about easing gas prices ahead of the midterms. He released 2 nephews of Maduro's wife from U.S. prison in exchange for 7 American hostages, a deal that looked like a win but was actually a tacit admission that the maximum pressure campaign had failed. And he quietly dropped the pretense of Guaidó's legitimacy, allowing the opposition to fracture and Maduro to consolidate power. But here's the thing about splitting: it doesn't work. It leaves everyone unhappy and achieves nothing. The sanctions are still strangling Venezuela's economy. Oil production has collapsed from 3.5 million barrels a day in 1998 to just 700,000 today, and the country's GDP has shrunk by 75% since 2013. The humanitarian crisis continues, with over 7 million Venezuelans fleeing the country, creating a migration wave that's destabilizing the entire region. And Maduro? He's still in power, still playing the victim of U.S. imperialism, and still using repression to crush dissent. The only difference is that now, he's got Russia and China as lifelines, and the U.S. has no leverage left. Now, let's talk about the 2024 election, because that's where this gets really dangerous. Trump is already framing Biden's Venezuela policy as weak, and if he wins in November, he'll have every incentive to escalate. We've seen this movie before. In 2019, Trump's team was obsessed with Venezuela, and they came within a hair's breadth of military action. John Bolton, then the national security advisor, was pushing for a strike, and Trump himself reportedly asked his generals why the U.S. couldn't just invade. The only thing that stopped him was the Pentagon's reluctance and the fear of another Iraq-style quagmire. But if Trump returns to power, that reluctance might not hold. He's surrounded himself with hardliners like Elliott Abrams, who was the architect of the Reagan administration's disastrous Central America policies in the 1980s. Abrams has a long history of advocating for regime change, and he's already made it clear that he sees Venezuela as unfinished business. And let's not forget that Trump's first term was defined by a willingness to use military force. Witness the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the strike on Syria, and the escalation in Afghanistan. If he feels cornered domestically, he might see Venezuela as a way to rally his base and project strength. Even if Biden wins, the pressure to do something about Venezuela won't go away. The bipartisan consensus in Washington is that Maduro is a dictator who must be removed, and that consensus is reinforced by the media, the think tanks, and the lobbying groups. The New York Times and the Washington Post will run op-eds calling for tougher action. The Atlantic Council will publish reports on the need for a comprehensive strategy. And the Venezuelan opposition, desperate for U.S. support, will keep pushing for more sanctions, more covert operations, more everything. Here's the none of these options work. More sanctions will only deepen Venezuela's economic collapse, creating more refugees and more instability. Covert operations will be exposed, as they always are, and will backfire spectacularly. And military action? That's a fantasy. The U.S. military is stretched thin, with commitments in Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. The last thing the Pentagon wants is another forever war in Latin America, especially one that would require tens of thousands of troops and years of occupation. So what's the alternative? The answer is staring us in the face, but Washington can't bring itself to admit it. The U.S. needs to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere, at least not in the short term, and that the only way to ease Venezuela's crisis is through diplomacy. That doesn't mean legitimizing his regime, it means negotiating with him, as the U.S. has done with far worse actors, from the Taliban to the North Koreans. It means easing sanctions in exchange for concessions, like free and fair elections, the release of political prisoners, and an end to repression. And it means working with regional partners, not against them, to find a solution. But here's the none of that is politically viable in the U.S. right now. The moment Biden or any future president signals a willingness to talk to Maduro, they'll be accused of selling out democracy. The Miami lobby will scream betrayal. The Republicans will use it as a cudgel. And the media will frame it as weakness. So instead, we'll keep doing the same thing, hoping for a different result, and Venezuela will keep spiraling. Let me give you a historical parallel. In 1979, the U.S. faced a similar dilemma with Iran. The Shah was a brutal dictator, but he was also a U.S. ally. When he was overthrown, the U.S. refused to recognize the new government, imposed sanctions, and backed Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran. The result? A 444-day hostage crisis, a decades-long enmity, and a nuclear standoff that continues to this day. The U.S. had a chance to engage with the new Iranian government early on, but it chose confrontation instead. And we're still paying the price. Venezuela is the same story, but with a Latin American twist. The U.S. had a chance to engage with Maduro early on, to push for reforms, to offer incentives for change. Instead, it chose regime change, and now it's stuck with a failed state on its doorstep, a migration crisis that's fueling political instability across the region, and a dictator who's more entrenched than ever. The question isn't whether the U.S. can afford to keep doing this, it's whether it can afford to stop. And right now, the answer from Washington is a resounding no. That's the real tragedy of Venezuela. It's not just a foreign policy failure, it's a domestic political failure. The U.S. is trapped in a cycle of escalation because its political system rewards confrontation and punishes compromise. And until that changes, Venezuela will remain a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when a superpower refuses to accept that the world has moved on. The British Empire didn't fall because it lacked power, it fell because it couldn't adapt. The U.S. is making the same mistake. And Venezuela is just the beginning.